Hitting recording, and I'd like to welcome Alex and Florian into today's conversation for the Pirate Academy, where we try and explore what it takes to build truly self-sufficient and self-reliant communities somewhere on the planet, as maybe one way of dealing with the impending climate chaos situation and all the effects it will have, so that we enable us and other people to still thrive actually in that situation. And before we go into that topic, we would really love to learn more about you, Alex, and about where you're coming from, how you're thinking, why you're thinking like that. So I like to ask for the configuration of your brain. Why is it configured that way, and how is it configured? And because that helps us and everybody else who might listen, building a context of what you're describing later.
Sure.
Okay. I'll just mute myself and I let you go for a while. You just let us know when you feel you've expressed who you are.
Okay. Thanks for having me on. I'm just thinking about how far to go back, but I think because we've probably got a global audience, it's relevant to say that I'm here in London. I've lived in London for getting on for sort of 20 years, on and off, and I'm British. Take from that what you will. And you know, I grew up just outside of London, really, and professional parents. So I had I've had a lot of privilege and a pretty nice life to date. And I think the turning point for me in terms of how I began to really think and look at the world was I studied, I've always been interested in politics and history. And I found it fascinating through school. So I initially studied literature and then sort of switched when I did a postgraduate to international relations. And I think that was the moment when I started to really understand, taking a deep interest in how the world works. I think at the time I thought I should just try to understand how the world works, because I had this literature degree. I graduated in 2008. It was the middle of the financial crisis. And, you know, everybody just said you won't be able to get any kind of job. So I thought, well, I better study some more and study something that will allow me to be taken seriously. And I didn't really think much more of it than that, other than I ought to find a job. And it was really just quite coincidental and accidental that I ended up studying Middle East politics. I sort of, within the scope of international relations.
Interesting accident.
Yeah, I know. And the funny thing was that we were told categorically that it was very difficult to get onto the Middle East modules because they were oversubscribed, because it was it was Iraq War, post-Iraq War, and everyone was very interested in that area, as geographically no one wanted to study African economies, for example. So I just kind of ticked some boxes that I thought sounded interesting without really much thought. And then I got onto these modules. I got both the Middle East modules. I got the Middle East sort of general political and socioeconomic understanding of the Middle East, and also the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that was a real sort of baptism of fire in terms of understanding what's kind of going on. And I'd say layered over that was international relations theory, which is all about why we do what we do, how states behave. And we're you're very, very much schooled in sort of neoliberalism and how, the theory of self-interested man. And I remember thinking at the time, this doesn't really make total sense to me, because I don't think that states do behave all the same. I think that, you've got a real divergence, especially because I was studying Israel really closely. And, you know, and it's interesting that you're in fact there, but you know, really looking into all the factors that was, you know, enabling it to emerge as a nation, and the psychology behind that. And I realized that you know, nations have psychologies just like people do, and the level of trauma that a country has endured, you know, to an extent defines their behavior as much. So I just was really grappling with this, but you're kind of told that this is how it is, so just get on with it and write your paper, otherwise you're going to fail your degree. So I did that and just kind of made sense of it in my, what, you know, researched it, evidenced it, as you do. But that was sort of in the back of my mind, this feeling that, like, I don't know if this is really quite what I think. And I went, and after that did a whole trip around the Middle East, this is pre-Syrian war, backpacked through from Turkey across the border through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, and ended up in Egypt in the end. So just tried out, you know, I've always taken the view that history and the world can only really be understood at close quarters, as well as from a book. Like, I didn't really think that I could possibly get everything from a book, so I wanted to go and kind of live it and listen to people on the ground explaining their experience of this conflict or this situation, to really, to gain that. So I won't go into, that was obviously a whole pretty amazing experience that really did shape me. And I came back to the UK.
How long did you take for that?
That was 6 months. And
wow.
I took a month at the end. Actually, interesting to this sort of conversation, I worked and lived on a permaculture farm in the West Bank. So the idea was, it was set up by a couple of British ecologists who were very, very anti-Israel, very anti the, quite anti-establishment, I suppose, and wanted to enable the local Palestinian population to live off the land more effectively. So they would teach them how to grow, and, you know, it was all, we'd wash everything with lemons rather than disinfectant, and had a compost toilet. And so it was really, again, that was opening my eyes to another sort of area of what conflict brings and how you can survive it. Although I have to say, I'm not sure that what they were doing was all that effective, because I think people were still very much, you know, like, we want the new technology, we want dishwashers and all of the stuff. We don't really want to feel that we're going backwards. But you know, it was a really interesting experience, and I was only 23, so I don't think I really knew what to make of it. And I came away from it feeling like, God, I don't know if I can. I was like, I'm not going to take a job in this area. Like, there's too much hatred, and I'm too sensitive. I'm knowing myself. I'm too sensitive. I'll crumble within a year. I think I can't handle it, actually. I don't, and I also, knowing, you know, coming in as a British person into Middle East politics, like, I don't have anything to contribute to this. Like, I don't think, or at least that's what I thought at the time.
But can you go a little bit deeper into why did you think you would crumble? Because there was just so much negativity, and it felt really intractable. It felt like this. I think there was a moment when I was studying, the trajectory of the conflict, and when the Rabin, one of the Israeli prime ministers, was shot by a right-wing Jew, and he. I mean, I think that's correct. I quite can't remember, but I remember thinking at the time, God, if you really want to solve something like this, you're going to have to put your life on the line. You're going to have to be willing to make that level of sacrifice. That's what peace takes in this world as it is. And I think it just was really like, if I'm going to commit to doing something like this, it felt quite scary that it would require so much of me. And I guess I didn't feel, it was a combination of not feeling like I could, that I think it would potentially make me miserable in the end. And there was somebody else, my friend was dating a war correspondent at the time, and he was really undergoing some post-traumatic stress and saying, you know, your life is chasing misery. And I remember thinking, what role could I play here? And
would it really bring the best out in me so that I'm actually useful? Because if I'm not useful, if it doesn't suit my personality, then it's just a wasted effort. I think that's what I was getting at. So that's,
Okay.
yeah, does that answer the question?
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of went away going, well, I don't maybe want to go deep into conflict, but I do want to do something that tries to understand and support better systems. And so I ended up veering towards international development. I was like, this is maybe a bit, there's roles I can play here that would suit my skill sets or a bit better. So I kind of went towards campaigning because of my background's literature. I think I like communication. I think fundamentally nothing changes unless people understand it, and kind of it sparks their imagination. So I ended up working for the Global Poverty Project, as it was called then, but it's now Global Citizen. So it was really, really new in the UK at the time. It's an Australian NGO that has since really expanded a lot, but they were just setting up in the UK, so they had this brand new team, and I just worked as an intern for 6 months. But it was great because they were so new and experimental. I did loads of fun things like interview academics about what poverty means. I thought they were quite progressive in terms of trying to challenge like poverty porn campaigns. So they were about, we've got to stop using pictures of starving children. Like there's an entire other narrative going on in Africa with entrepreneurs and brilliant people doing incredible stuff. And the story is, there's a dual narrative of success that is not told. And that's because, that's when I first also understood the flaw in charities, that they were essentially putting plasters on a system rather than trying to uproot it. And that they were, that these narratives of misery are there to keep funding cycles going, and essentially that just entrenches the status quo. So I did that. That was really, really shaped my thinking, that period of time with Global Citizen. Then, it was still quite a tough time financially, and I kind of I definitely also had a bit of a sort of crisis of I'm sure lots of people do at this age, but because I was also simultaneously understanding quite how unequal a lot of the systems were, and that it was deliberate in many respects. So this wasn't just about like where I'd been in the Middle East and seen conflict, but that was quite far removed from me. Then I was understanding in the UK how, for example, one of the examples always sticks in my mind was vulture funds, which are private hedge funds that are enabled to buy debt, and you can buy debt off in countries that are already poor, and then sell it on more cheaply to make a profit. And I thought, and that was allowed in UK. Those deals were allowed to go through UK courts until 2010. And it was around that time because we were speaking to people who ran a campaign called Jubilee Debt Campaign, and they were trying to stop that. And I just remember thinking, God, we know this and we allow it. And I just had this little sort of, and I spoke to my dad, who's a lawyer, who spent his entire life kind of thinking about justice and justice system. And I know lawyers have a bad reputation, but my dad's very much all about standing up for, representing the rights of the individual against the system. So I asked him, I said, what do I do? He goes, well, you can just disappear. You can go and find a corner of the world where you're sort of not bothered by that, some beach somewhere, or you can try and fight one corner of it, or you can just accept it and get a decent job and have a nice life yourself. So he sort of laid out the options. And I think, I don't know, I went through many, many ups and downs at that point. I decided to train to be a personal trainer at one point, which I gave up halfway through because I was like, I don't really know why I'm doing this. And then eventually sort of veered back towards, trying to do something that could improve the status quo. And I worked for a social care charity for a year, which I liked because although it was really tough, it brought me very close to sort of like a front line of some kind. So I was going inside homes with people with learning disabilities and mental health problems and understanding the kind of care that they receive and what's wrong with that. And so that was pretty, and the experiences that the staff have, I was very much in charge of staff and staff training And so that was all, sort of percolating. And there was a lot wrong with that, but it was still really...
I just wanted to say, I mean, that's choosing the path of going into the beast, right?
Yeah, because I remember speaking to former classmates from my master's degree who'd chosen the ivory tower route and gone right into the Foreign Office and was sitting on the desk, gone, I want to get into Middle East politics, I want to be in the belly of the beast in a different way. But fundamentally, when I was talking to them, they were like, I'm literally in an ivory tower and you're sort of on the front line of it. And I said, I think there's more learning to be had there. I think I feel more confident in my own beliefs and my understanding of how things work, let's say, by being closer to the people who are right there dealing with the problem, and rather than receiving reports or... So I think that if you want to know how my mind works, that's really how I operate and where I think good information comes from. And then I kind of, but for other reasons, I left that job, which I won't go into, but I ended up working sort of, it got really tough, that job, I have to say. And so I sort of felt that I needed to give myself a bit of a break, and I went to work in a think tank, which you could say was the opposite of what I've just said, but it felt like
the ivory tower.
Yeah, a little bit, but there was, for various reasons, like just a need for some stability, and I didn't necessarily intend to stay there as long as I did, but I got promoted, and they gave me an opportunity to work more on communications, which was always what I felt that I was better at. So that was, then I ended up there 6-7 years, kind of just kept going. But over time, that feeling crept back up on me, the feeling that this isn't changing anything. This veneer of progressiveness, let's say, just isn't actually doing the thing that's needed. It's saying the right things. There is some good work going on. Like, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't dismiss all of it, but fundamentally, much more radical things are needed to really move the needle here. And it also came down to an individual level. The people that I'm seeing as leaders aren't brave enough to say what needs to be said, to challenge the people who they probably rely upon for a sense of status and identity. And that might sound critical, but I think we all probably have that to a degree. I wouldn't discount myself in that. And for that 7 years, I was probably there too. I wanted to be respected and people think I was smart. So yeah, I just became more disillusioned. I was doing work and it felt like it wasn't doing anything. There was lots of cultural frustrations, which we'll get into culture, but I had to get a lot of sign off in order to make small changes that just felt unnecessary and were just hindering the real impact. I was in charge of communications for a big membership body, and the members really wanted to do stuff. A lot of them were entrepreneurs and sort of change makers in the broadest sense, and they wanted to get on and connect with each other. But we were putting red tape in their way. We were like, even God, when GDPR came, it was like, whoa. But even before that, we would make the pathways really difficult, and we tried, because it was so much about brand control from the centre, and it totally contradicted the supposed goal of impact. So I was very confused, I suppose, because I still very much trusted that the people above me understood something that I didn't understand. And so I just kind of kept going for a while. And also, it was quite a nice place to work. We had a nice central London office, and, all the trappings of that comfortable.
Yeah, it's horrible. That's what you learn. You trust the people who are somehow higher in the power hierarchies, because somehow they must have gotten there because they know something. But then it starts dawning on you that they actually don't. They're just as clueless as you or everybody else.
Yeah, and I think I started to get it when I was examining the mechanisms through which I understood people would get there, because I was doing interviews to recruit new people to come in, and I was skimming them, like, truthfully. I was just going, well, I'd look at it and go, I've got a good degree, work somewhere reputable, bring them in for an interview. And obviously in an interview you get a bit more chance to understand what the person's about. But I think there was a real sort of what I don't know, you call it a herd mentality of where it would end up just veering towards the same kinds of people with the same that we felt we trusted, but it really wasn't working from my perspective. So I got to a point of I'd taken on a new role. I'd sort of was planning, they let you take a sabbatical after 5 years, which was great. So I thought, well, I'll do that and I can maybe create some space to figure things out. And I'd done what I always do, which is take on too much. And I'd taken on another sort of research project on the side around domestic violence. But again, it was that craving to kind of get back to the roots of where the problems are and what's really going on. And I was working with this fantastic woman called Anjali Ralph, who is now a published children's author as well, but does incredible work on supporting refugees and domestic violence. But that's an aside. But we just worked together for sort of 8 months on this project, and then I was also I'd taken on an internal role that was just around GDPR and compliance, and it was quite boring, but I don't know, problem solving. So I took this break. I decided that I'm going to go away and figure out because I'd really reached a point of disillusion with the organisation, and actually I suppose I was thinking, is it possible to change anything? Like who are the heroes that I'm looking for here? I can't find them. They don't seem to be. I haven't come across anyone who I'm seeing has that level of commitment and a vision, I suppose, and is willing to be braver and a bit more radical, without veering into the kind of radicalism, let's say, that is divisive or very a little bit aggressive in how it's. And this is the point we'll get to on culture, about what kind of culture we're creating, because you see when the system starts to fail, you get a sort of backlash against it, and there's a lot of aggression that comes with that, because people are upset and disappointed and underrepresented and angry, and I think that's totally normal and fine, but all it does is sort of compound that feeling of division and divisiveness between human beings. And I don't want, so I couldn't orientate myself, and that was something I also found when I was studying politics. It was so divisive that's not a culture that I see as going to get us anywhere in the long term. Yeah.
And then what happened? So you took that sabbatical, and you were disillusioned, and you were looking for some northern star.
Yeah. So actually, what I did is I went to see one of my good friends who lives in Bali. I suppose in some ways.
So
off the beach.
The other option you're finding.
Yeah. Well, yes. I unfortunately arrived at that point of gone, okay, well, and there was some other personal things going on in the background, in fairness, which contributed to that. And I just was like, I need a rest. I need to rest for a little bit. So I went to see her, and I actually just started by writing down, okay, like this isn't working for me. So what are the things in my life that I do want? Like, what are just the basic conditions? Rather than trying to figure out a sector or a role that I wanted, I thought I'll just figure out what I want my life to feel like, because it doesn't feel good. So I think I was like, I want more adventure. I want a bit more excitement than this sort of daily routine of going to my office, going to Pret-a-Manger, going to my office, going to Pret-a-Manger, and then maybe to the pub and back. I want to meet interesting people and fundamentally want real connection with people, a sort of lack of routine. And so I just scribbled down some things. And then about 2 weeks into being in Bali, my friend and I went on a trip up a volcano, and she just casually said to me, oh, this is like a micro adventure. And I said, that's a really nice way of talking about it. And she goes, oh, it's not me. It's this term that this other guy has coined. His name's Alistair Humphreys, and he's like an adventure writer. And he does this thing around micro adventures, like how can you make the most of your 5 to 9 hours rather than your 9 to 5. And so I just, looked him up on Instagram, started following him, and just kind of coincidentally, like a couple of days later, I'd signed up to some job alerts because I was sort of keeping an eye out for things I might want to do. And it's a site called Escape the City, and it helps people to escape more their corporate jobs. And I saw that there was an advert to be this guy Alistair's intern for like totally remote, 7 hours a week, very informal. He wanted help kind of reorganizing his blog, working on his next book, that sort of thing. I thought, this is perfect for me. This would be such a fun like interim opportunity, chance to do something more freelance. So I applied to that and got that job within about 6 weeks, and sort of started working with him. So that was sort of got me into working with authors or sort of, yeah. And did that for a couple of months. And then I was sort of starting to run out of money. So
So did you experience some adventures in those couple of months? I mean,
yeah, oh yeah. I moved from Bali, I went to Vietnam on my own, and sort of just traveled around the country, meeting people, exploring. I was trying to finish also a novel that I'd been writing. That's another story. So I thought, well, I'll just have that as a project, and I'll do a bit of this work for Alistair, and I'll just travel and see what happens. And yeah, I met some incredible people. So, but I knew that this probably couldn't last forever because I was going to run out of cash. And fundamentally, I think I always knew that I don't want to just be a nomad. Like I'm not. I thought about that a few times before. I want to contribute to somewhere rather than just drift between things. I think. So yeah, what happened next? Yeah, so I was doing that, having fun. It was about December, and then I saw another job alert from Escape the City, which was to work with, was a job advert for a right-hand pirate. And I thought, well, that sounds different. But actually, I have to say, I was on a transit bus going from the airport to the plane in Hanoi. And I remember looking at it on my phone and having this really like tingling feeling of like, this is the thing. This is adventure. The thing. Okay. Yeah, I was like, I just read it and I just scanned all the requirements and thought, this is exactly what I should do next. It just feels really right, in the same way that the other job felt really right. And then I'd actually downloaded a chapter of Be More Pirate on my Kindle, but I'd not read it because I realized it was going to be about social change, and I couldn't stomach that at the time. I thought, here's another guy who's got a plan, but he's made it all sound really fun. But I've lost faith in all those authors coming to talk, because I remembered Sam, he'd come to talk on the stage at my old work, because they would hold events for authors with great new ideas, and I was sort of like, that makes no difference. So, but I was still intrigued enough, so I went back and read the book properly, and still had some questions, but definitely thought it was worth going for, because I could see how it would use my skills, and it would give me the opportunity to see what I'd done wrong and change it, and create a community and a network that would be more authentic, and we could focus on impact and not vanity metrics around newsletter lists and things like that. So, well, that's what I had in mind. And that broadly was the job description, to be a community manager and partly an EA to Sam to sort of help him with some admin and things. And yeah, I came back to London, interviewed, he set some tasks and things, and I did take him to task on what it would look like, and is he would it succumb to those metrics of success that I think are false, and is this really are we really committed to doing something, and it's not just about the brand and Instagram and there's so many things in his book that supported my argument. So I was like, I could quote back at him. I was like, you said this, and so let's do this. Yep. And that's when I ended up becoming part of this pirate movement. So
that's how we met you.
Yeah, and that's how we met. And I've spent the last 2 years being I've promoted myself from right-hand pirate to quartermaster to captain. And So I initially just spent the first 6 months or so, let's say, diving into all the people who'd written to Sam in the 6 months, in the 8 months since the book had been published, who'd responded to the concept of Be More Pirate and all the things in the book that it talks about around rebelling and rewriting rules, and how had they really applied that to the work that they were doing in their lives. What were the things that seemed to work more or appeal to them? And so I started, to develop stories and case studies and understand it in more depth. And that has eventually become a book. But, in the interim now, I also started to talk about it myself to different audiences, because there was so much interest coming our way. We decided to split the resource, and rather than me supporting Sam all the time, I could go and talk to new audiences, especially ones that were more sort of public sector or charity background, because I probably had more understanding of that, whereas Sam has always worked more on the business side. But we try to blend that up. Like, that was just how it evolved. And and just there's been all these incredible opportunities, and I've gotten to know all these pirates and just the brilliant things that they're doing to really take that idea of, like, how do you redistribute power? What are the mechanisms we need? And also fundamentally, what's the mindset we need for this new world? And it's a bit messy. It's not always clear, but it's it really has hit on all those points that I wanted. Like, it's such an adventure, and it's really exciting. And yeah, I get to meet people like you that just come into the suddenly message me out of the blue, and I'm like, it's so great.
Wonderful. Yeah, I really think we have a picture now.
Yeah.
Of who's Captain Alex. And I don't want to, because you're already on this perfect segue into the question. Actually was almost hoping for you to just take over now, but I'll pose the question, and then you can just slide into it again. And that question, you hinted at it a couple of times, is imagine you're somewhere on the planet, remote, somewhere in the outback. You choose the country if you want, or the climate zone, or the circumstance, and you're there with, let's say, 200 people, a couple of hundred people, and you're building a truly self-sufficient, self-reliant community. And in this case, you're more the quartermaster. You're more in charge of the cultural aspects. And another question is, how do you build the culture? What is needed to create a solid but anti-fragile, not too brittle culture, and how do you help people live that culture? I think, creating it in your ivory tower is one thing, but actually living it is another. And we just heard that you're all about the practical implementation, living it.
Yeah.
So that's what we'd like to explore.
Yeah. So how many people am I in charge of, did you say?
200, something like a healthy keyboard, something between 100 and 1,000, something like that.
Wow. So I think that the first thing to think of, well, it's the mechanisms that will allow the culture to flourish. So first up, decentralization, the idea, I might be in charge, but I would certainly decentralize that into much smaller groups. Because I think the problem with centralized or culture being dictated from a center or a hierarchy, is that you lose the transparency and openness very, very quickly. And I think that's the key to flushing. Let's say we're trying to prevent conflict. That's fundamental to the first fundamental to a good culture. So I think you've got to air out the conflict and the resistance. And you can do, there's means to do that, but let's say conversation is the first tool, like open dialogue about, if I disagree with you on this and you disagree with this, we've got to flush it out, and we've got to do it in an open forum. So, and that can't be done in a really, really big soul group. So I would need to break people down and perhaps identify some people who might take a leadership role. Then there's definitely a question around leadership and how leaders come to be. And this is something I've learned over the last year or so in terms of honouring the individual and their strengths, and that some people are good at being at the forefront, and some people don't want to be, but also respecting the collective, and that has to come first. So there needs to be mechanisms that enable leaders to come to the fore, but also be removed easily and without conflict. So whether that's a kind of voting system, but again, easier done in smaller groups than in a big, large one. So I think just making sure that those mechanisms are like, how do we decide who's in charge of making a decision? Is it that we are going to, on certain decisions, make it as a democracy, as a small group? But are there circumstances in which, we need a final say in who is going to be the leader there? And I think that is probably true. Otherwise, if you decide you're going to, and this is what I've learned, if you decide you're just going to have a flat hierarchy, which I think can often be the kind of flip response to like hierarchy and too much management, I've seen that flat hierarchies just quite often don't fully work. So you need to have clear roles and responsibilities, and in certain circumstances, a person will lead. Like if you have let's say in our newly formed community, there's a need to go and get some food. Someone should perhaps be the leader on that project, perhaps the person with the most skills in that area. So that's another point about culture. When we devolve into these small groups initially and have this first sort of dialogue, and we start to talk about roles and responsibilities for the group to make it work, we've got to know what people are good at and what they want to do. So I feel like these are two key things that get lost in organizations, because we also change over time. So really getting a good understanding between people about who am I, what am I good at, and what do I like doing? Because the problem we have at work now is that most of us are doing tasks day to day that we don't actually enjoy. And perhaps there are going to be some tasks that nobody enjoys. So how can we split that more equally so that burden is shared? But it's got to be initially, I think, some level of transparent dialogue around this. And that fundamental honesty, you don't get, again, in our current sort of culture and workplaces, because you already have to go into a pre-existing culture where there's a set of expectations. But when we've got this blank slate that we have, we can just set it, it's brilliant. We can just set it from the outset.
I have a question around that. So you say you need a conversation. That's the primary tool to evolve the culture.
Yes.
As I understand it. So let's say there's 200 people.
Yeah.
How do you facilitate that conversation?
Right. Yes, exactly. So this is again about the mechanisms. You need someone to act as facilitator. You need somebody who has that skill set, who can go, I will protect the space for us, because again, this is something that doesn't happen enough in gatherings of people. You need someone who can and set some guidelines around what dialogue and conversation looks like. For example, we should practice like deep listening. We should recognize that a dialogue isn't about projection. It's your primary function here is listening, and once you've digested it, then you can give your opinion. So setting I'm not being really precise on that, but setting some guidelines around how we do dialogue, and making sure that everybody has a chance to be heard, and it's not just the dominant people who like speaking that talk. And I know I'm taking this quite deliberately from something called Flat Pack Democracy, which is a campaign to take over local councils in the UK here by getting lots of people to stand for local council elections as independents, not associated with any of the major parties. The idea being to go beyond party politics and to allow people from the community to represent and, you know, influence the community. And when that's worked, I've spoken to the guy who set up the campaign initially, and he's, you know, this is 10 years ago, and how it was successful was because he did implement these sorts of things. He brought, you know, he had someone who was solely a facilitator. They got a professional facilitator to be there in every single council meeting, so that they didn't have this kind of angry screaming wasn't allowed that had previously taken place, where, you know, the people with the personalities would simply argue their point until the nth degree. And so it's something that would have to be worked out as you go, but I think it's probably the foundation.
Okay.
Setting the space for dialogue that allows for real understanding. And I've run a lot of this also with my pirate crews, and trying to work out what a safe and a brave space looks like. And I don't know if I've been reading a little bit of, around the work of Amy Edmondson, who talks about psychological safety in a space. And how that's so imperative to workplace culture. But I think the nuance of that is really hard to get at, and it goes wrong a lot of the time. Understanding how bold people can be with their ideas, how much you can say that might be on the borders of offensive to people, because we are very much now in a bit of a moment where people are very afraid to say certain things. So I think even setting the tone and the parameters of like what is what do we do when somebody says something that offended somebody else?
I think that's hard with 10 people, let alone 200.
Yeah, it is hard. But we already work in units of 10 people, groups of 20, organization. And so just because it's hard, does that not mean it's worth doing?
Of course, we're here because it's hard. Yes,
we're here because it's hard.
We're here because we believe it can be solved. I'm just trying to figure out how to deal with the 200 people.
Well, so yeah, it fundamentally has to be broken down. So sort out your basic culture at that micro level first, and then when you come together as a larger group, there's some kind of baselines that are set. And also, I would bring in, because I do think it has to start at the individual level, I would bring in things like meditation, because I think that people need to be able to process their feelings and emotions differently than what we do now. I don't think that's been in place for a very long time. So that when, you know, you do have those conflicts, which will arise in groups of 10, 20, 100, of course they will, but there is space to go, this is normal. Like your feelings of guilt and shame and whatever comes up is fine. And that there are mechanisms in place to help people to deal with that in a healthy way. So yeah, and then I would, you know, that would probably, if we're talking, you know, let's talk more broadly then about the wider group and how they operate together. Things such as like when there is, you know, perhaps somebody does do something that is deemed really bad, that you would have a sort of restorative justice kind of system. That's how what I would bring in, like a dialogue based, human to human way of dealing with the crime. Let's say it's a crime if we set some laws, but the transgression that isn't like punishment based necessarily, but it's like, why did that occur? What happened with that person that made them behave in that way? And how do we understand that? So yeah, that's definitely one.
That reminds me of, I'm just reading Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, where he talks about these 6 boys that were stranded on an island, and when 2 had a fight, they were sent off in different parts of the island for 4 hours to cool down, and then come back and apologize to one another. So that sounds very much like conscious implementation of something like that.
Yeah, it's sort of a rehabilitative way of dealing with what people do. I mean, we know that this works better. It's just that we don't, yeah, it's one of the parts of the system that we don't have right now. So that's definitely something I would do. The other thing was that I just came to mind was around how people spend their time day to day in order to fundamentally make sure that the individual human unit is healthy, so that you diminish the chance of them doing any, causing conflict because they're fundamentally unhappy. I would ensure that people had a good balance of tasks that they do like and tasks that they don't like, or even, let's say, I don't know, because I'm not entirely sure where we are in this space yet, but let's say we have some access to technology because technology is prevalent. We don't want to spend all day at our screens. There's got to be a bodily element in the day for everybody all the time. Like, none of this sort of, sitting around being, for example, I wouldn't therefore have roles where, someone is always doing that, because I think that everybody needs a balance of all the different kinds of work that could be done. I would definitely try to, and this comes down to my original philosophy about being on the front line. Like, it's important that you understand how all the elements of the society work. So, every man would be required to be a carer at some point to somebody or something, rather than that work which typically falls to women. Women would go and do, self-defense, and that's maybe not a good example. Hopefully we need self-defense, but let's say they would go and be the ones being mechanics, configuring those new solar panels or whatever, No. I know that that's a stereotype, but we know that those things have typically been how things have fallen. So it'd be a chance for everyone to, just for learning, to understand, oh, that's how that works. My dad built the house that they have in France literally from scratch, and forced me to go around the house and understand how the electric switches work and how it's built into the walls. Yeah. So.
Okay. So what you look, I'd like to try and sum up what I understood to see whether I actually understood what you were saying. So you would begin by helping people to ground themselves, but also to live in a healthy way, as healthy as possible. So, because that makes them fundamentally capable to be part of a constructive culture.
Yes.
And then you would break them up into smaller groups for sense making and dialogue. I'm not sure why you would break them up into smaller groups.
My vision is a little bit sort of, I just think that for organizing units, decentralization is really, really important. In order to understand what to do day to day and what needs to be done, you need to work in smaller groups. And the dialogue part is simply that's just a fundamental foundation in order to make sure that you don't veer into conflict, that everyone understands each other, and that if you're going, well, actually that's not working, that's aired and opened, and therefore you need mechanisms from the very beginning to have those kind of conversations regularly. It's based on something I've seen in workplaces where they'll keep doing the tasks, but without the conversation about why are we doing this, and then people will start to assume things, and then but because there's again no space for it to be aired, those assumptions grow, and they can quite often grow into resentment. So just having that regular space to come back to be like, how was that? How did that go for you? Did you did that work?
So is that a bit like, I don't know, a family, like an artificial family type of structure? Okay.
Yes. So I just call them, smaller organizing units, teams, hubs, whatever we might call them. It's just simply a way to break down the wider society in the way that how we have now. We have, central government and local authorities based on geographical areas, and they don't get enough decentralization enough to be effective. So those groups would be almost like entirely autonomous, but contribute to the whole. And that I think it's easier to be healthy in those smaller units than it is as a whole, if they can kind of
Is it just one question to that? Is it always the same kind of groups or smaller groups? So it's like, as I said, it's family, or that's just changing all the time, or is it?
Well, I think fundamental to it is you wouldn't be locked into anything.
Yeah,
If
okay,
you're locked in, that's going to make people. I mean, I'm really trying
but
to.
people tend to just be in a smaller community or in a family, even if there are maybe houses or smaller groups. So is it natural then, or is it just, how do you build up these smaller groups? Is it like, okay, catch the group I like-minded people around, or is it just, yeah, everybody should bring, is it diverse? How you make like diversity possible?
I would say that if I had the choice and I'm the leader in it and I'm able to decide what those groups look like from the very outset, then yeah, I would try to make them diverse groups. I think we have to learn to live with the different perspectives and life experiences. So I would try to, yeah, create them with a range of people from different backgrounds, ages. You know, I think it's fundamental that maybe you should have an elderly person and a child in each group, because then you have the experience of how do we look after a child in this new community, and how do we look after an elderly person, and what are the roles there, and how do we make use of the able-bodied people, and how do you value everybody in society? So they're like microcosms of like what the broader society would look like. How do you value? I mean, all of this is about how we value people, and how do people stay happy and healthy? That's, I mean, I was going to say at the beginning that maybe, you know, you'd be wanting to set out a sort of vision for what the society looks like, but really it's quite simple. It's like, how do we thrive, as you said at the beginning? So
that leads into my next question, because I think you pointed it out very nicely. So it's a microcosm of the larger society that we're embedded in. So in that sense, there's some form of sense making and airing of emotions and integration of learning, etc., happening on the let's say the hyper local level of those teams, of those families.
yes.
How then do the decisions percolate up again into the wider society?
Yeah, that's when I think that it would run something a bit like a citizens' assembly or a people's assembly, in that you would have a centralized decision to make about perhaps the future of the community, and that each group would be able to kind of decide that their verdict on that decision together. So you would break it down, and what you're allowing within those smaller units is to have the level of discussion and debate that is probably required to really understand the implications of the decision, which we don't have now because one person is sort of one vote, and then you would come back and you'd probably then elect to have a representative from each of the groups to come back to the sort of broader citizens' assembly, so that it wouldn't be too big. But they, you know, you'd known from that you'd been able to feed in at like a significant level into what you wanted to happen. So yeah, I would see, that's why I think that the decentralization is also really important, to be able to, does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. No, definitely a deliberative democracy kind of process.
Do you know of groups of people who organize themselves that way successfully?
Not really, not taking into account everything I've talked about, and not consistently. There are definitely examples of things like this happening through, like I said, deliberative democracy processes. In part, what I've spoken about is based on an experience I had when I did work at the think tank, and there was a project that was a sort of citizens council, and it was about helping people to debate economics. And it was right after Brexit, so it was like we're having this national dialogue on whether we should be part of this huge trade body or not, and no one really knows whether it's a good idea or not. I mean, some economists have a good idea, but the majority of the public clearly were not well informed, or I think, and this was the key thing it was addressing, was they just don't feel like confident in that remit, because economics is, you know, seen as quite a highbrow idea. So it was really breaking down to them, like, what is economics? Like, when we make an economic decision, what does that mean? So there's some of the the more complex ideas, but really how much of it comes down to values and judgments. And once they'd understood some of that, though, you could see people having a breakthrough, like, oh, okay, I now feel confident to talk about this and to, to make a decision, to vote on this with knowledge. And so seeing that level of dialogue happen and the ability to debate with each other, it was really effective. And they were totally random group, 25 people from around the country, no prior knowledge of each other, and really, really diverse group, some from London, Manchester, etc. So I thought that I would take that, because it's not just about making the decision either. The fundamental thing about it is that it's about the impact it has on you as a person, how you go on this sort of journey of realizing, in your own understanding and learning. So, yeah.
So I think I have a good picture of the general understanding of or the mechanics or the general design.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say there's one or two or three people in there that really don't like that idea. That's somehow they would want somebody or themselves to be in charge and lead this whole operation. It's moving too slowly for them. All of this talking, all of this back and forth. How do you deal with those people?
Well, you have to air it, but like, why don't you like it? What would you do otherwise? Can you suggest an alternative and tell us what you? I mean, we wouldn't try to coerce them into this way of being, but we'd try to find a way around it. Like, if they really, really don't enjoy, the dialogue part, maybe they can participate in a different way. Is it possible that they could come less frequently, or somebody could relay that to them in a way, and just discuss it? I mean, you've got to discuss the benefits and the disadvantages of that. So it's really, I guess it gets down to the crux of, well, what do you want then? What would be ideal in your mind? I mean, I think also it's a relationship point that people, there's always somebody that somebody does get on with and listen to. And so it's about finding, that's finding the people that they do connect with and having a way to communicate through them. Does that make sense?
So that type of conflict resolution requires somebody who understands the social fabric of the community.
Yeah.
Or can you also somehow delegate that to the community itself?
Yeah, I think that would in part be the role of the facilitator in the in the smaller units, because that's really what a facilitator's job is. I mean, I think they're seen as quite neutral, but it's about understanding social dynamics and adapting to them. But I think that, okay, so I would also say perhaps then, to avoid the conflict, I'd implement a little bit of the piracy, in that there would be an overarching code of conduct for everybody across the community. And, that would be something that would be decided on from the beginning from those units, such as, this is how you deal with discomfort. This is how you, there's a baseline level of respect. So I'd have some principles agreed upon, so that there's a level of accountability there. So that if someone is kind of just going off, doing their own thing, contravening the kind of the code, or doing something that puts the whole group at risk, that they can be called back in and held to account. And like I said, it would be the restorative justice aspect. It wouldn't be like, you've done this and now you're punished, which is what the pirates did. It would be, why did you do that? How can we understand it? And, I think the ultimate punishment in the community would be, well, I think you're ready to leave. And then they would be sort of, turned out to go on their own path. Because that's really what the pirates also did, in that if the code was voluntary, you signed up to it if you agreed to everything. And once you were in, you had to, but you could voluntarily, you could leave if you didn't agree.
If you have a boat.
If you, where are you?
Well, they would maroon them on islands. Well, that was a much more brutal time. Let's say we're heading towards a better age now. The new piracy is.
Yes, that's what, at least what we're trying to build. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I have another question. Is this kind of topic is now somewhat clear? I don't know, Thomas, I don't want to interrupt you in this question, but I have a totally different question to how to build up a community, or community, let's say. Because now, as you see, we're all faced with Corona, and we see that there's something missing. Like I would say, it's rituals. So you can do, so you can do like everything online, more or less. You can buy your food. You can do it like in our communities here now. But what is really missing is like rituals, like going out, seeing each other without like, without a task or something, without a need maybe. So how would you implement this kind of, so that you don't have like to meet only when there's a problem or there was something to solve? So what about rituals or art or whatever, all these like things you don't really need, but now we see we really need them, or I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this all comes down to what does a healthy, flourishing society need, doesn't it? So there's lots of things that we can touch on. I was going to say we should make everything circular and sustainable, but those things, I was just trying to set the baseline. So absolutely, art, creativity and expression, like that is so fundamental. Like the expression of yourself. Whether you do that individually or in a group, but also the sense of communion, of being connected to everybody else. And what does the alternative to church look like? Do we have I don't know if you've ever heard of something called Sunday Assembly. That's something that's emerged in the UK. I don't know if it's gone further, but an alternative,
there are some people doing that in Germany.
So non-religious alternative to what church ultimately brings people, which is connectedness to the community, some sense of hope and joy, and quiet time as well. So I don't know, it would fundamentally be up to the community to decide that. I would never impose anything, and I imagine there would be lots of variety around rituals and what people wanted to do, but I would say in terms, so absolutely, that's really fundamental. I'd also implement rituals in the individual sense as well. Like lots of people talk about morning routines, and I think I know lots of people have frustration with that, going, I want to do one, but I wake up and I do emails. Just maybe recognizing the importance of that, and that comes down to, again, what our understanding of what allows humanity to thrive. And we've gotten it wrong over the last century with our obsession with productivity, and the fact that people get better ideas when they are quieter and have time to rest their brain, and that there's a moment for intense productivity and a moment for deep rest. So I would totally normalize that need for downtime, and whether it's ritualized through doing something with your hands, like sewing, or I don't know, gardening, not even gardening, because that's probably more fundamental to the community resources, but something that's playful, and laughter and joy and fun, like just being silly as well is so important. So wouldn't make it all serious. Sounds serious now I'm saying it.
So each of these communities needs a Brit to bring in some humor.
Yeah, and all the people, our sarcastic humor. That's really the thing. But every single person that group that I've seen try to write a pirate code have brought something in around fun or joy or play in one version of that.
What's the minimum amount of people you think are required to write a good pirate code?
Minimum?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is a minimum. I'd say there's a maximum, maybe. I don't know.
But you just described the mechanism of how to trickle it from small groups into larger groups. And in theory, that's imaginable, like in a stacked system up to very large groups. But I mean, yes, the three of us could sit down and come up with a pirate code for between the three of us, but it might be hard for other people to accept that code. So the community might always stay very small because of that. That's where the question is coming from.
Okay. It's a good point. I'm just trying to think about what kind of principles you would minimum. Yeah, I mean, the way I was thinking about it was theoretically, like, you know, everybody in a sense has their own personal pirate code, because they have you would probably have a set of principles that you believe in and some behaviors that you want to adhere to. And how does that scale upwards when you bring it into a bigger group? I don't know, maybe 10 would be a good yes, yeah. I've just written a pirate code for our community with 2 other people. So it isn't a nice group of 3, and we would somewhat expect that people would get on board with it, partly because it's so based in pre-existing ideals.
I totally can follow the feeling that when we tap into our own humanity, we will also at the same time tap into common humanity and come up with something that is applicable to more people. But at the same time, allowing a very small group of people define a code for the larger group turns into more centralization. That's why I was asking that question. Or is it good? I mean, it can also say, you could also say that with this community, maybe the first thing, just one thought, then I'll shut up again. With this community, maybe the first thing you do in the like the founding group, and that might be 2, 1, or 3 people, we set up a code, and then everybody else can decide whether they want to be part of that code or not, right from the get-go. Or it emerges from the community. That's 2 different ways of doing this.
Yeah, I think what was, yeah, I'm understanding. And I think really the whole point and purpose of a code and the nature of it is that it is quite broad. We're not talking about creating from the get-go prescriptive ways of being and doing. We're talking about the fundamentals of how we establish a thriving community. I think most of that will be things that people can agree upon. And it's simply that as we get into the nuance of what that means in terms of translating it into tasks, behaviors, and operational stuff, that's when you start to go, well, what does this really mean in this context? And that's probably where a bit of the debate in the People's Assembly comes in. Because let's say, you know, we say our principle is to respect everyone, treat everybody with respect in this community. Well, what does that mean? So when we'll probably have examples that will crop up where we say, well, that person wasn't respectful, and they go, well, I thought it was. So that's when you'll start to really maybe then start to add more to it as you go along. Because you'll get to the nub of like, what happened here, what went wrong, and that, you know, that's essentially how a law or a code would evolve. But I would say that, yeah, it should never become so prescriptive that people are constricted or limited in some way too much. I mean, yeah. I have to think it through with an example in order to really test my understanding of it. But that's probably how I would work. It would say there are some broad principles that probably most people would agree to. And yeah, if you don't want to agree, you would be out, you can leave. But they wouldn't be so controversial that people would go, well, I can't get on board with that.
And that also ties back into what you said about the individual being clear about themselves, because I would my feeling is that many people wouldn't be able to really deeply, truly decide whether they want to be part of a specific code, because they might not even be clear on their own code.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. That's how we've got to work. Look, I mean, we're talking about creating something better here. So we can't get stuck in what is and how people are now and what. So.
Of course. So that means that the exercise of writing your own individual personal code might be first.
Well, ideally, that would be helpful, but the reality of that is that takes longer, and I think that we would need something to group everyone from the outset to make it functioning from the very beginning, just as an outset. And it can't look. The idea is that it would be adapted as you go, and you would support people to do that individual work. To give a sort of parallel examples, like look at the Sustainable Development Goals, right? People sign up to that all the time and go, yeah, here's some broad principles that we can get on board with that seem good. We agree with education for everyone. Do we do those things?
Nice
colors. I know. Yeah, we agree.
I can count all the way to 17.
No, I mean, I don't know. I have debates with people about this and whether you can create a plan for that many people like this. I think it has to have meaning at a much more individual micro level even, and it has to have you have to eke out what do we mean, because we say we're trying to get rid of poverty, but yet we continue with mechanisms that that compound poverty. So
are there questions that you would ask people, or would you to give to people who want to write their own code? So you say, okay, this is a set of questions, and if you think these questions through, then you might arrive at something that gives you a first version.
That's exactly what we do. That's exactly what I do now. I ask people what really matters to you, and there are different, for different people, there are different ways to phrase this that will resonate. So finding the ways to say it. So what really matters to you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What do you care about? What's your ambitions? Like if you were to make the papers in a good way, what would that ambition? What would it be for? What's your best version of yourself? What was another question I would ask? What would you make sacrifices for? What do you want to fight for? Where does your power come from? Or like, let's say power is maybe a broad word, but what's your source of strength? What do you do? And you can dig into that a bit more. What do you do naturally, really easily? When do you feel most inspired? Because that's about understanding what gets a person fired up, and that's so important if you're going to allocate people to tasks that they want to do, that sounds really prescriptive, like allocate them to tasks. But if you're going to make the most of a person in a functioning society where they contribute and they're also happy, then you need to know those sorts of things. And most of us don't know those sorts of things because we were just shoehorned through a path before we had a chance to really think about it. And no career advice we get at school really digs into those things. So we can often be too far down the line in some route before we go, hang on, that's not who I am. So those are, and even going to things like what scares you, what feels out of bounds for you, what are you avoiding? Because then you get a sense of, okay, where's not the opposite of that. What are you not giving yourself permission to do or be or say? Because then all these peel back layers, and then you start to understand a better sense of who you are at the level where it's not what society told you to be or do. It's not who your parents wanted you to be. It's not who you expect this group of people for you to be, because that can be very easily, you come into a group of people and there's immediately a kind of socialization happening, and you quite easily fall into something, a role. So yeah, I think that work is really important and fundamental. And I think when I talk about being more pirate and try to break that down, what it all means is it's one part self-development, one part culture change or group, sort of change within an organizational setting, and one part activism, as in what's my impact on the wider world. And that's what in a code, what you'd be looking at, those three elements, I think.
Okay. And you could also ritualize a lot of that, right? Because as you say, we're along a path, and then we're stuck in some ways, and then we ask these questions, and you can also only peel down so many layers or drill down so deeply at one point. But maybe in a year or so, you can see more, you can get deeper. But you would only do that if you have the opportunity to do that. If you somehow ritualize these questions, like you once a year, everybody in your community shuts up for 3 days and thinks these questions through for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
That could be something, a new way of celebrating Christmas.
I guess it's also very connected to the part of meditation you want to bring in. So it's one of these part of development. So I guess there will be something which is like unlearning also, like, because as you said, you tend to get in a role you don't want to go into. So it's good that there's maybe some part of like unlearning rituals or unlearning whatever ideals. So maybe this is also a great part for the first community, probably.
Yeah, and I think that probably when you guys set that idea of you're in charge of this new community, in my mind, I'm sort of like, well, this is a fresh, a blank slate. But actually, of course, it's never a blank slate. And if we're talking about this in the real terms of what would we do now, we'd be bringing people with so much baggage, and yeah, that unlearning, questioning of why are things, why do I believe this is how it is? Where's that come from? Is it, examine it. It might be that it is still correct, but it's probably possibly not. I think this is always something that I think about in terms of conflict resolution, whether it's at the state level or whether it's individuals bickering on Twitter. It's not about what you're saying. It's about, why did you come to those conclusions? That's what we need to understand about each other. How did I arrive at the idea that this is wrong or this is right? And then you can that's when you get the ground for understanding, I think. So definitely unlearning.
Cool. I've learned so much already. And I really would feel much more comfortable now than just 1.5 hours ago to start building a community somewhere in the outback. Is there anything else that's you have on your mind that you would like to share around this, or do you feel complete for today?
I don't know. I was thinking, I was like, oh, well, we haven't talked about patriarchy. We haven't talked about.
All right, go ahead.
No, I know. There's lots of detail and elements of the culture that. But I think that those are a result of not addressing all the things we have talked about, which is the individuals sort of being embedded in a current system, and also not having the ability to air conflict and misunderstanding and understand. Like, for example, I had this conversation with a male friend recently about patriarchy, and because I said I totally understand how it can feel quite weaponized towards you, and you're a good guy, like I think, but when we were talking about it, I think he said something to me around, you don't be self-deprecating, and I said, and I can't remember the context of the conversation, but I said, well, I'm trying to not be self-deprecating, but I said, I just want you to understand that sometimes that I'm coming from a different starting point than you. And this is obviously a whole conversation we've had around race as well. When I walk into a room, I am received differently. And it's no one person's fault. It's simply that. It's the perception of society that has grown up thinking that mainly older men are figures of authority and therefore know the answers and are experts. And I get a different reception when I go into a room and I have to do a talk or talk to a group of people, because I'm quite often mistaken as someone's assistant, or have been in the past. And that, you know, it is what it is. And I think it's a product of just of the subconscious messaging we've had for a very, very long time, not a reflection on my ability or your morality at all. We don't even know we're doing it. So that's all I'm trying to say, is that my confidence is almost sometimes a reflection upon what I understand is happening around me, in that I know that I will garner less authority from the outset. And it's my responsibility to also deal with that and not let it hold me back. But I want you, and it was just that he sort of said, well, I treat women the same. I don't. And I was like, but even if you think you do, you just have to understand that that's not the way that it's received. So dismantling and unpicking that sort of stuff. And I think that, and after that, we had a good conversation about it. And he was like, I said, I totally hear where you're coming from. I just want you to understand why I might sound like that. Yeah. So there's lots of interesting and productive conversations that could be had, but I'm not seeing many spaces for those. What does freedom of speech? I mean, freedom of speech is such a fundamental thing, and we're not getting that right.
Yeah, but that's the whole point. I mean, we're building the Pirate Academy exactly because we believe that it's two vectors. One is we're running out of time, like 10, 15 years, and then, and the other thing is it's the systemic lock-in of the current systems we're dealing with is so strong, whether we want that or not, because we have been programmed by the system, and it's really, really hard to change that programming. And so to optimize towards consciously changing the programming, creating environments where we can change that programming, and at the same time enabling groups of people to set themselves up to be able to survive the coming climate chaos is why we're doing this here, right? So in other words, it is of course very important to think about the things like patriarchy and racism and freedom of speech, but only in the sense as how do we ensure in a new culture that we don't allow those things to happen in the future without giving them space by carrying them through. That's, yeah. I think that's a very, very hard thing to do. And I'd be very curious as to how you would solve that tricky one.
Yeah, I think, yeah, an understanding about how to, it's not easy. I think that there has, first of all, like I said, we don't really have spaces where we get into it in a constructive.
We're creating one now. So
we're creating one now. I would say that there are, when it comes to things like, patriarchy, it's part of a big system that was built on exploitation in general. And so we're moving towards a system that is not going to be based on exploitation, but upon human strength. So I think it's just a recognition of so one thing I have thought of, and I apologize if this sounds sexist, but you know, there's definitely swathes of people who you know, feel that there are masculine and feminine traits, and that men do certain things and women do certain things. And to an extent, and this is the problem about trying to shift to a new paradigm, is that to an extent you have to meet people where they are for a while at least. There's got to be a certain stabilization of things as we transition. So it's acknowledging that perhaps the traditional modes of being masculine may need to still exist for a long time still. And so, you know, is that about doing more practical things, let's say? And it sounds like stereotypical, but I think we should air what is. So it might be, you know, I've been thinking, based on what you said about, you know, creating new technologies and solar panels, and this would, you know, come into a sort of circular economy, sustainable society. There's huge capacity to have people who mend things that we don't do that very much anymore. We expend things a lot. So I think that sort of engineering kind of side of things, like those jobs have typically been done by men. It's just saying that there is still space for you to be masculine in the more traditional sense, and then, you know, alongside that, you start to have conversations about what this all means, but not by stripping people of their identity altogether, which is, I think, what some of the conversations happening now. It's going, you know, either shaming people for, you know, being who they are within the culture that they've been brought up in, or you know, saying you should be behaving in an entirely different way. And I think that's not constructive. Does that make sense? So it's really about acknowledging who people are now and where they are, whilst also simultaneously figuring out ways to perhaps bring them towards a new vision. And I've often found through Be More Pirate that people are more open than I imagined. You think that people are quite, so whilst yes, it is, we are entrenched in our belief systems, I feel that people want something better. They just mentally have a lot of blockers about how to get there. So yeah.
Yeah, and no real concepts, because this is very confusing, right? I mean, but we can go into the details of what it means to be more masculine or feminine, and whether that's actually tied to your biology or not, etc. But I think pointing out what you highlighted earlier, building on the strengths, and really focusing on identifying strengths and independent of color or gender or other properties that people might attach to themselves, or other people might attach to other people, and just identifying strengths as the core set of properties, and then building on these. That could be, and being radical about that, not accepting any other form of differentiation between people, because you could even see a strength in a 5-year-old who can, because the strength of a 5-year-old is that the 5-year-old looks at some of the things the first time, and through that can give us new perspective. And if we always actively search for the strength, and then nurture that and expose that, and then we can move away from these from these current paradigms. Just yesterday I was watching this this video from I don't know, but probably 100 years ago, there's this airplane, and it's apparently has lost one of the tires. You know, it's this like open one prop, two-wing double-decker. I don't know how you call them in English, but plane. And then there's this woman, and she ties this a spare wheel onto her back. She gets on another plane. She's flying up in the sky. She climbs onto the wing. She climbs onto the other wing in the sky. She climbs down. She attaches that wheel, and then that plane lands safely with her still standing on the wing. And I was thinking about that in terms of gender equality and you know, that would the entire activity. What generally, if you would ask somebody out in the street, who is that a man or a woman doing this thing? My guess is that the majority would say that's probably a man.
It would be James Bond, nowhere else.
And so, but maybe maybe it's nothing to do with gender. Maybe it's just that she was the most courageous person around, or she was the person with nothing to lose, or I don't know what. But so the interpretation space that we put around that is absolutely crucial. And if we
and I would imagine
that at the core of the culture.
Yeah, so that would be a point of the code, that it's a strengths-based culture.
There's another point, I guess, which is part of this, but not only the strengths. I read something about, I think it's about a text about animal rights or something, and there was a philosopher pointed out that in our culture, we're always just pointing out of the differences. But it's better when you just point out where you are similar. So, and that's like in general, like in cultures or in races or in gender. So, because then you just point out where you are similar and what you have the same ideas or the same strengths or the same whatever. So, and then it makes living together easier than just to point out. And it's might be a big problem in like here in this area where I live in at the moment. They always point out where the difference, not what they are similar in. And there are quite a lot of similarities. So even when you take the Bible or the holy books for both religions, there's so many similarities. So many people are the same.
Yeah, so, all the food that they share, like cultural rituals.
Everything, even the same city. Everything took place in Jerusalem. I don't know why. No,
that's a really good point. That would be, I guess, one of the sort of mechanisms you'd use to try to dispel conflict and things, saying, okay, let's shift the focus to our similarities now, or something along those lines.
Something along these lines is a good point at which I think we could end that conversation today. Not saying that we should end the conversation in general, because I really believe that there is a lot more to learn from Captain Alex. But I also think, as I said earlier, that I would really feel much more confident now to build such a community.
Okay.
And looking forward to building one. But thank you so much for being here, for sharing all of this. And I really look forward to our next conversation, deepening these thoughts, picking up on where we're stopping today.
It's been a pleasure, and I would love to pick it up and hear more. I kind of want to hear your version of the culture as well. Both of you.
Well, it'll be a copy of yours now, because
no. Thank you so much for having me on. Look forward to continuing.